Our goal here is to look at 3 examples of groups that utilize terror to accomplish their goals. Now, the first example is ETA, or the Basque separatist movement. Now, ETA is an acronym within the Basque language. Eskadai ta Askatulasa. And I'm very sorry for butchering that, but understand that the difficulty in pronouncing Basque is amplified by the reality that Basque is one of the few languages in the world where you can't necessarily trace its roots. It's not a Romance language, not related to English, or anything like that. So ETA translates to Basque homeland and liberty. Now, the Basques are a cultural group whose traditional homelands are between the current border of Spain and France in the Western Pyrenees Mountains. So again, their language is not only dissimilar to any other language in Europe, but it's unrelated to any other language in the world. The concept of Basque nationalism and the subsequent separatist movement began in the late 1800s and had the goal of an independent Basque state. So they want a completely independent state. They were able to survive the years of Franco's regime by existing in exile in Paris and keeping a low profile in Spain. The ETA divided into factions in the 1960s. There were the nationalists who advocated for an independent Basque state, and there were the idealists who wanted to form a nation based on Marxism, Leninism philosophy. They became more militant and engaged in sabotage and assassination. Franco's regime set out to crush the ETA and resorted to arrests, beatings, and torture. By the end of the 1960s, the leaders had been rounded up and all put on trial. So after Franco died in 1975, Spain's newly democratic government set out to try and provide regional autonomy for Basque provinces, and they even offered pardons to ETA leaders who renounced violence and terrorism. The next decade, ETA killings by bombing and terrorism increased tenfold compared to that under Franco's regime, and most of the assassinations were of military officers, judges, and government officials. Financially, ETA was supported by robberies, kidnappings, and extortion. It did form a political arm to fight for political rights while also engaging in violence like assassinations and car bombings to achieve their goals. 2 members were kidnapped and killed by Spanish security forces in 1983 as part of what was called a dirty war against the ETA. And 2 government officials were convicted for their role in the murders in 2000. ETA called a ceasefire in 1998, which lasted about 14 months. Ceasefires and subsequent bombings to break the ceasefires occurred frequently throughout the early 21st century. In 2010, ETA announced that it would no longer carry out armed actions, and the Spanish government essentially said, "We'll believe it when we see it." After a conference that was attended by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, the group announced a permanent ceasefire, and they officially disbanded in May 2018 after a half-century of violence that claimed the lives of over 800 people. And interestingly enough, this mural is in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and it shows solidarity with the Basque movement. And that transitions us to our next example, the IRA. The ultimate goal of the Irish Republican Army is to end British rule in Northern Ireland and to reunify the island of Ireland. They wanted to use armed force to mark British rule as ineffective and achieve an independent republic with the help of their political arm, Sinn Féin. The IRA operated independent of political control, and their leadership actually overlapped with Sinn Féin. The IRA initially was led by Michael Collins, and used guerrilla tactics to harass the British Empire. Subsequent negotiations resulted in the Irish Free State, which was granted Dominion status, and 6 northern counties that comprised Northern Ireland, known as the Ulster Province. These terms were disagreeable to many IRA members, so it split into 2 factions and devolved into civil war. The 2 sides disagreed on tactics, and even though the IRA was declared illegal in 1931 and 1936, they continued to engage in bombings and acts of violence. They even appealed to Adolf Hitler to try and get the British out of Ireland. In 1949, Ireland withdrew from the British Commonwealth, so the focus of the IRA was the unification of the Catholic Irish Republic with Protestant Northern Ireland. Catholics in Northern Ireland were not supportive of actions in the 1950s and early 60s, so not much was done. However, Ulster Catholics began to advocate for an end of discrimination in voting, housing, and employment by the Protestant majority. Violence against the demonstrators led to an escalation of attacks on both sides. Arguments over use of violence within the movement did lead to a split within the IRA in 1969. The official IRA eschewed violence after 1972, and the provisional IRA, or the Provos, believed in the importance of terrorism to get the British out of Ireland. The Provos expanded their violent campaign to include mainland Britain and continental Europe. All told, they were responsible for the death of about 1,800 people, including 600 civilians. Now, 13 Catholic protesters were killed on Bloody Sunday in 1972. So the IRA did enjoy increased support, but it began to wane in the late 1970s. They were funded by extortion and racketeering, and they were even assisted by wealthy Irish Americans. They got weapons from international arms dealers and the Libyans. In the late 1990s, the estimate was that the IRA had enough weapons to continue their campaign for another decade. The political faction grew in power in the 1980s, and Sinn Féin helped negotiate a ceasefire in the late 1990s, but still the IRA persists. In 2005, they announced that they would end their violent campaign, but the murder of a former leader in 2015 revealed that they still had some of their organizational structure in place. Now, the final example is Al-Qaeda. Formed in the 1980s as a network to resist Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda's members were recruited from around the world. It dispersed following the Soviet withdrawal, but continued to oppose what they considered to be corrupt Muslim regimes and foreign presence in Islamic lands. They were based in the Sudan in the early 1990s, but established headquarters in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Al-Qaeda merged with other militant Islamist groups, and at times declared holy war against the United States. They established training camps around the world, and its agents carried out attacks on U.S. embassies in Kenya, Tanzania, and an attack on the USS Cole in Yemen in the early 2000s. And the September 11th attacks, 9/11, was also the responsibility of Al-Qaeda. After 9/11, thousands of members were captured or killed, and the leaders were driven into hiding. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan altered the ability of the country to be used as a training ground and headquarters for the organization. Oddly enough, it caused the terror group to alter its organizational structure to make it harder to defeat. The attacks were not ordered from its official leaders concentrated at the Afghani-Pakistani border, but by localized militants who shared the same ideology and operated independent of the official chain of command. They were responsible for more attacks in the 6 years following 9/11 than in the 6 years prior. The theme was to attack U.S. allies like Israel, the UK, Turkey, etc. They also use the internet more and more as means of spreading propaganda and as recruitment. Now, Osama bin Laden, mastermind of 9/11, was killed May 2nd, 2011, but 1 month later, his replacement was announced. So again, 3 examples of groups that use terror as a means to achieve their goals.